Whenever I play damage over time build, one question that I get a lot is, should I have ailment duration? POB is telling me that's a really big number. The short answer is, it depends. The long answer is, there's a relationship between ailment duration and ailments deal damage faster, and the innate properties of ailments, which often results in a damage gain, which often results in you gaining damage through having longer duration ailments. However, if you're unfamiliar with how all of this works, then it might be a little tricky to get right. For example, temporal chains or unbound ailment supports are very common sources of increased ailment duration. And this won't directly increase your damage, but it does increase the amount of time for which the enemy is afflicted with the ailment, i.e., the damage per second is not increased, the total window is, which can have some interesting side effects. And by the way, if you're interested in ailment builds, maybe ailments in general, then be sure to get subscribed. While you're down there, leave a like, or after you're done watching this, check out some of my other ailment builds, which will be in the card up in the top right. So for the most straightforward example of duration equaling damage, let's take poison. Poison is a chaos-based ailment that can stack infinitely. This means the longer the duration of your ailments, the more poison stacks you can have on an enemy. In a lot of cases, that means more damage. I say a lot of cases because the more stacks of poison that you can have, the longer your ramp up time based on your attack rate. So if the enemy runs out of health before you finish ramping up, duration is not increasing your damage anymore. But on the other hand, what about bleed and ignite? Well, these ailments can't stack, so it's not more DPS to extend the duration, right? Kind of. It's not more DPS if that's all you're doing. But more duration can cause your bleeds or ignites to overlap, which increases consistency. For example, an ignite that lasts 4 seconds has a much higher likelihood of being affected by elemental overload, even if you're not critting on every cast, than an ignite which only lasts 1 second. And if you increase that duration all the way up to 8 seconds, it's even more likely yet again. Something else to keep in mind, and something else that POB doesn't really calculate all that well, is damage ranges. If you roll the minimum, your ignite is going to be a lot smaller than if you roll the maximum for whatever skill you're using. And the same goes for bleed here. In other words, the longer duration of your bleeds or ignites, the more likely you are to high roll, and therefore the higher average damage. A lot of this stuff kind of gets glossed over because POB just assumes elemental overload is up for every single ignite, and that you're doing a perfectly average amount of damage. Sure, over a couple thousand casts, you are doing a perfectly average amount of damage. But from cast to cast within a given boss fight, there's definitely a significant range for a lot of skills. Then, to make things a little bit more complicated, what about ailments deal damage faster? This makes your damage more immediate. Remember that poison situation? Having poison deal damage faster doesn't necessarily increase your DPS, assuming the enemy has infinite health, but it will increase your DPS by lowering the ramp time, assuming that the enemy has finite health. Spoiler alert for anyone who's wondering, enemies in PoE have finite health. So for an individual instance of a dot, be it poison, ignite, or bleed, having that ailment deal its damage faster increases the DPS but not the total damage. On the other hand, for a single instance of a dot in isolation, having increased duration increases the total damage without increasing the DPS. But in most practical real-world situations, increasing the duration does have a slight effect on the DPS, and making it deal damage faster also has a positive effect on your DPS. But you do have to be careful to not go overboard. For example, if you reduce your ignite duration too much, say by combining Swift Affliction with Replica Emberwake, you might reach a 0 duration ignite. Sure, in theory, your ignite is still doing 2 million plus damage per second, but it's dealing that over 0 seconds. It can't damage the enemy, therefore, all of that damage gets discarded, and the enemy smashes your face in. Now, from my experience, this is really only an ignite problem. There's no way to get your poisons to deal damage that much faster, and even if you could, you wouldn't really want to. Remember, poisons dealing damage faster is only a DPS gain if it cuts out your ramp time on finite health targets. You're not going to go overboard with this, because once you overinvest, say to the point where you're doing your full damage after a single attack, congratulations, you've taken the best part of a damage over time build, that it deals damage over time, and turned it into a hit build that just kind of causes a funny animation with enemy health bars. And while poison is the most extreme example of this, the same can happen with both ignite and bleed. Now, it should be noted there is one important point of distinction between ailment builds and non-ailment damage over time builds. They don't have damage ranges. They don't work with elemental overload anymore, and you can't get them to deal their damage faster. Maybe this will change at some point in the future, but for now, just keep in mind that all of these things do apply only to ailments, minus the fact that if you have a higher duration, you still may have higher consistency or uptime on a boss as you're dodging around and not really attacking. Of course, in the case of something like Toxic Rain, much like with Poison because it stacks infinitely, they do function kind of a little bit the same way, where more duration means more total damage. Again, assuming the boss has infinite health, because if it has finite health, and hopefully it's dead before you fully ramp up. So if you're putting together a damage over time build, what are some good best practices? First of all, don't underestimate the value of Unbound Ailment support. It might not be your highest DPS in PoB, but much of the time, it's going to have a significant impact when you need it most, against scary boss monsters where you're going to be spending a lot of your time running away and less time constantly chain casting on the boss. And similarly, be a little bit hesitant of Swift Affliction. If you feel like damage immediacy is a problem, absolutely add it in, because it will increase damage immediacy. After all, it does cause your damaging ailments to deal more damage. But it will shorten their duration, meaning you're going to have to reapply things sooner. So use some judgment here, and if you feel like too many rares or even bosses feel bad because your ignites, poisons, or bleeds are just falling off too quickly, then maybe remove Swift Affliction or try Unbound Ailments. And finally, when it comes to dealing damage faster, don't go overboard. I'd advise a little bit on almost every damage over time build. After all, it's a good way to get immediacy. But if you're using something like Replica Emberwake, or otherwise just stacking a ton of ailments deal damage faster, then probably don't get too much more, or try to balance it out with some increased duration. Again, if you want to know more about my build, stay tuned. It's an Ignite Wave of Conviction Elementalist that I've been playing pretty much since day one of the league. At this point, I'm pretty happy with my gear, so I'll be showcasing it sometime in the near future. But for now, I have a very important question. What are some of the big hangups that you have in regards to ailments? Personally, I find damage over time builds, including many ailment builds, to be some of the best builds to play in PoE. I don't need to constantly be worrying about hitting the boss. I can attack or cast once, then spend some time running around, dodging, and dealing nearly my full damage, while I get to focus on boss mechanics and just staying alive. But I also know a lot of people are pretty hesitant to play damage over time builds, probably because they have lower numbers in PoB, and also because ailments are a little bit confusing. So leave some of those confusions down below, and who knows, you might be the genesis of another video in this series. For now though, that's all I have today. But before I go, one other thing of importance, I'd like to say a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for their continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this one possible. Or you can support completely for free just by leaving a like and getting subscribed to see the next video. If you want to watch something else, again, there's going to be several damage over time builds I've played, which are up in the card at the top right. Or YouTube will have another recommendation of what to watch over on the right side of the screen. Thank you again for watching, I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.